Right now, Bolivia is in a constitutional crisis, to put it mildly. It looks like they've found themselves smack in the middle of a Cold War era violent right-wing military junta. Some of the candidates running for the Democratic primary in 2020 have spoken about this violent right-wing military coup in Bolivia. I'm specifically going to talk about Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Tulsi Gabbard's responses to this coup. But before I do, let me just make sure that we are all on the same page about the events that have led up to this coup and the events that have happened since it took place about 2 weeks ago. Evo Morales, the democratically elected president of Bolivia, won the most recent elections that took place in October. I believe it was October 20th. Immediately after the election, the Organization of American States, the OAS, puts out a report, and at the very end of it, they basically insinuate that there were election irregularities and Evo Morales rigged the election so that he could win. With absolutely no evidence to back that up, no numbers, no data, no statistical anomalies, no verified reports of mass voter suppression, none of that. They just put out this idea insinuating Evo Morales rigged the election, which is a bold claim to make against anybody who's won an election, especially a president of a country. So you'd want to have evidence to back that up, or at least grounds to start some type of official investigation or something to back up your claim. But in the case of Evo Morales, it's especially, they should have definitely had evidence to back up their claim, because the first indigenous president of Bolivia, a country where the population is majority indigenous, he's been overwhelmingly popular in the country. He's the most popular politician, I believe, in the history of Bolivia. He's definitely the most popular president, because I believe in the 2014 elections, which were the most recent ones before this 2019 election, Evo Morales won like 60% of the vote. There was an 89% voter turnout, I believe, and he won 60% of the vote. No other president in Bolivian history has ever won more than 51% of the vote. He's the first president to win a majority of the vote. He's overwhelmingly popular. The policies that he's implemented, the lefty economic policies that he's supported, are insanely popular and successful. He drastically reduced the poverty and extreme poverty rates in Bolivia. He provided healthcare to thousands of people, indigenous people who wouldn't have had it. The point I'm trying to make is, if you're going to levy the charge against a president as popular as that, you're going to level the charge that he had to rig this most recent election to win. You better have some evidence to back it up. But of course, the OAS didn't have any evidence, and that didn't matter to the mainstream media and advocates for regime change here in the United States. So the media across the world basically ran with the narrative that the OAS put out, that there were irregularities and Evo Morales rigged the election. They ran with it over and over and over again, uncritically, without ever attempting to verify the claim for themselves. So much so that it became the predominant narrative, the groupthink, the mainstream establishment consensus on Bolivia that Evo Morales rigged the most recent election and he's actually a dictator. That became the establishment wisdom on Bolivia now. Again, with absolutely no evidence. Nothing but insinuations and smears basically from the OAS. Now we have the international media and of course the US mainstream media manufacturing consent for regime change and forcing Evo Morales out by calling him a dictator and saying he rigged the most recent election with absolutely no proof. This emboldens and gives political cover to the violent right wing in Bolivia to do a power grab and try to take control of the country. So for a couple of weeks, the right wing had been leading protests across the country, demanding new elections, even though he won the plurality of the vote and nobody can prove otherwise. That of course got a bunch of attention and support from the international media as well. And they doubled down on their pressuring Morales to resign. Then about 2 weeks ago now, the police in Bolivia decided to join the violent right-wingers protesting, targeting, torturing, brutalizing politicians that are allies of Evo Morales. So the police give up the pretense of even trying to keep the peace and just join the violent right-wingers wreaking havoc on the streets. And this creates even more violence. It runs out even more of Morales' political allies out of the country. And Evo Morales finally caves and he says, you know what? You guys think I rigged the election? Let's have a new election. So Evo Morales one day calls for place, even though they just had elections in October and nobody can prove that those elections were tampered with in any way. Evo Morales caves, calls for the new elections. The very next day, the military joins the police and the right-wingers, calling for Evo Morales to step down, even though he just gave them exactly what they were asking for, new elections. The very day before, the military still joins the right-wingers and makes a public statement telling Evo Morales to resign or else. So now, basically at the barrel of a gun, Evo Morales resigns and flees the country in exile, gets granted asylum in Mexico. In comes Janine Áñez Chávez, who illegitimately declares herself. She just unilaterally declares herself the president of Bolivia because Evo Morales resigned. She had no more legitimate claim to call herself president than any random person in the street. Technically, yes, she's a politician. She's a vice president of the Senate, but she is not in the line of succession. Bolivia has a constitution, and in that constitution, like many others around the world, they have a line of succession. If anything would happen to the president, the next person in line would be the vice president. The person after that would be the president of the Senate. After the president of the Senate, it's the president of the Chamber of Deputies who would be the next in line. And if that entire line of succession, for whatever reason, cannot assume the presidency, the only person left is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about the Vice President of the Senate ever is supposed to assume the presidency in a line of succession. Nowhere in the Bolivian Constitution does it say that. So she just inserts herself into the presidency and calls herself the interim president of Bolivia. And this point right here just proves the whole feigned outrage about possible election irregularities in the October elections was bullshit. This coup, all these right-wing protests to force Evo Morales out over the election, that was all bullshit, because if it were just the election, if that it was being contested, that they think Evo Morales made a power grab and tampered with the election so that he can maintain power, and he's an illegitimate president, basically a dictator. If that was what they actually believed, then forcing Evo Morales out of office would have been enough, right? Technically, that would have been enough for them, right? But they also went after his vice president, ran him out of the country, and I believe the same with the president of the Senate. So it's not like the right wing in Bolivia was protesting a power grab. This was their own power grab, because they were trying to run out of the country all of Evo Morales' political allies, because their problem isn't with Evo Morales. It's not that they think he's an illegitimate president or that he rigged the election. Their problem is with the left-wing ideology. They do not like the way that they're running the country. And the violent right-wing opposition has their own objectives and has their own priorities. Now, earlier I mentioned this is definitely a U.S.-backed, violent, right-wing military coup in Bolivia that's taking place right in front of our eyes. I unequivocally say this is U.S.-backed because the U.S., we have our fingerprints all over this. The Organization of American States is going around masquerading, pretending to be this independent body, verifying elections in Latin America, but in reality, they're just a political tool of the U.S. State Department. 60% of their funding comes from the U.S. State Department. Now the OAS actions in this entire thing makes a lot more sense, because if they were this independent, objective body like they're pretending to be, they wouldn't make such a charge, they wouldn't make such a claim without evidence. Statistical anomalies, verified reports of mass voter suppression or voter intimidation, reports of actually changing vote counts, all of those things would have been verified before they went out, or at least heavily sourced before they go out and make such an outrageous, outlandish claim against a sitting president like that. But when you have the context that they're mainly funded by the U.S. State Department, then okay, when they come out and make the claim that Evo Morales rigged the election, that isn't because of some type of objective analysis that came to that conclusion. It's because they're pushing the political agenda of the U.S. State Department. The U.S. State Department is no friend of Evo Morales and the left-wing socialist movement in Bolivia. The U.S. State Department and the national security apparatus are aligned with the violent right-wingers in Bolivia. And I explained in great detail before, the OAS involvement in all of this precipitated these events, precipitated the protests, it provided cover for the right-wingers, the violent right-wingers, to stage a revolt to overthrow Evo Morales. It was a catalyst to all of this. So the OAS, the U.S. State Department, did not play a minor role in this. If that wasn't bad enough, reporting at the gray zone is that some of the leaders of the right-wing, violent right-wing military coup, they are graduates from the notorious School of Americas, a course or a class or a school, whatever, taught by the Department of Defense, the Pentagon in the United States. And it appears their focus is training people who go out and go back to their home countries and stage coups. And there have been multiple verified cases of these very same graduates of these schools, which are public record, also being involved behind the scenes in coups in many different countries in Latin America, also in Haiti too. So the reporting at the gray zone is that 5 or 6 of the people who have led this coup and are organizing it in the shadows are graduates from the School of the Americas. Basically the CIA and the State Department's How to Perform a Coup 101 course that they teach to the most notorious coup mongers around the world. And if all of that isn't enough, just the simple fact that this is just our playbook. This is our playbook to overthrow covertly and overtly Latin American governments, as well as governments in the Middle East and in other places around the world. We overthrow their governments so that they serve the interest of Western powers. They serve corporate interests and they serve our geopolitical interests. In the case of Bolivia, it's the fact that they're sitting on most of the lithium on the planet. I believe they have over 51% of the lithium on the planet. And lithium is a very profitable mineral. It's used in making batteries for phones and devices and all other kinds of things. Evo Morales, I believe after the election or before the election, might have been before the election, terminated a contract that would have allowed Western companies to have access to the lithium reserves in Bolivia. And conveniently, as soon as this right-wing military coup takes place, this violent right-wing military coup takes place in Bolivia, one of the first orders of business is to reinstate that contract that Evo Morales ripped up. And they've allowed Western companies to come in and get access to Bolivia's lithium. So same tune, just a different day. How do they put it in the Sweet Life of Zach and Cody? He was like, second verse same as the first. Like this is just the shit that we do. We overthrow governments on a regular basis, regardless of how criminal, unethical, and inhumane the fallout is. We do it on a regular basis, and we do it almost exclusively for corporate profit. The country is in chaos. Infrastructure is collapsing. They can't transport food between cities. Running out, there are fuel shortages. People's cars running out of fuel on highways. It's bad. It's bad. But now let's get to some of the responses from the Democratic primary candidates. Let's start with Bernie Sanders, who has been the best on this issue out of all the 2020 Democratic candidates. Now, Bernie was the first to call this a coup. He put out a tweet about it more than 2 weeks ago at this point. It was a solid response. It was a good response. Where I really had to tip my hat to him is when he's spoken about this to the media or at campaign events. And Bernie has not equivocated. He has not backed down from this. He's calling this a coup. And more than that, unlike we've seen him do with Maduro in Venezuela, he's actually providing a defense against the mainstream media propaganda that's trying to smear Evo Morales. He was doing some type of event with Jorge Ramos from Univision, one of the biggest fucking hacks in journalism, Jorge Ramos. He asked Bernie Sanders a silly question with ridiculous right-wing framing, but watch how Bernie Sanders handles it.
You wrote in a tweet that you thought it was a military coup, what happened in Bolivia. Many people have other point of view. They think that Evo Morales had been in power 14 years, that he wanted 5 more, and that he wanted to become a dictator. So what do you think?
No, I don't agree with that assertion. I think Morales did a very good job in alleviating poverty, in giving the indigenous people of Bolivia a voice that they never had before. Now, we can argue about his going for a 4th term, whether that was a wise thing to do.
And the OAS thought it was a fraud, the election on October the 20th.
Some people think that as well. But at the end of the day, it was the military who intervened in that process and asked them to leave. When the military intervenes, Jorge, in my view, that's called a coup.
All right, before I get to Bernie Sanders' answer, which was great, I have to talk about this horrendous right-wing framing from Jorge Ramos. First, let me provide a piece of context that Jorge Ramos, mouthpiece for the national security apparatus, has conveniently left out here. Yeah, some people have been criticizing Evo Morales for being in office for 14 years and running again for an election and winning a 5-year term. People have criticized him for it. But the Bolivian Supreme Court has ruled that it is not unconstitutional, it's not illegal, which is why his name was on the goddamn ballot in October to begin with. If it was illegal, if it wasn't constitutional, his name would not have been allowed to be on the ballot. But the Bolivian Supreme Court, the highest court in Bolivia, said it was okay and it was legal. Why now, after he won the election, everybody's clutching their pearls and calling him a dictator and simply acting like just because he had the audacity to run and win another 5-year term after already being in office for 14 years, that thereby justifies a violent right-wing military coup. That makes absolutely no sense. And Jorge Ramos didn't even insinuate that he rigged it. He just said, you call it a coup. Some people say he's been in office for 14 years and he was going to office and he was seeking another 5-year term. What do you think about that? Acting as if the logical response to him lawfully winning another term in office and getting 5 more years in office is an unlawful right-wing coup. That makes absolutely no sense. And in there, he's just insinuating that this isn't a coup. And like I said from the very beginning, the coup part is not debatable. To say that this is a military coup is not debatable. Former and current members of the military leadership in Bolivia conspired in a cabal to undermine and force the sitting president, the democratically elected president, out of office at the barrel of a gun in violation of their constitution and in violation of international law. By definition, that is a coup. So I don't know why he's trying to frame this as you say this is a coup and some people say it's not a coup, or some people say Evo Morales needed to be removed from office. That was such a shitty question and such a shitty point that he was trying to make. It was terrible. But Bernie Sanders answered it, did a good job. Like I said, he actually went a step further and defended Evo Morales' presidency and the policies that he implemented in Bolivia that helped thousands of people that were in poverty and people who needed healthcare. So credit to Bernie Sanders for doing that because nobody else is doing that. And he also made the nuanced point that, yeah, you can criticize Evo Morales for continuing to extend his time in office. Yeah, you can criticize him for that. But what's not up for debate is when the military gets involved and forces the leadership of a civilian government out of office so that they can resume control of the country or their faction can take over the country, that is a coup. My only criticism of Bernie Sanders' responses on Bolivia has been he needs to go a step further and call this exactly what this is. This is a U.S.-backed violent right-wing military coup. Emphasize the U.S.-backed part. We played a direct role in this. We kicked this off when we were the catalyst when the State Department had the OAS put out that report insinuating that there were irregularities and Evo Morales rigged his election in October. We were the catalyst for all of this, and if that wasn't bad enough, the people who are organizing this coup were all trained by the U.S. government and went to this very secret specific school that trains coup mongers around the world. It appears that he's just sticking up for a leftist government in this that has been overthrown by the violent right-wing opposition, which Bernie Sanders has been known to do. So credit to him for that. But he also needs to link this back to where it originates from, where it appears that it originates from U.S. imperialism, U.S. interventionism, U.S. regime change efforts in other countries. Now let's get to Elizabeth Warren's shitty responses on Bolivia. When she finally said something about Bolivia, it was on Twitter. It was a fairly weak sauce response. She was saying the interim government needs to limit itself to organizing free and fair elections as soon as possible, and that's all they should be doing. And they shouldn't be brutalizing protesters. Let me just say a couple quick things about this. So let's all acknowledge that Elizabeth Warren is repeating the propaganda, and she's helping manufacture consent for this coup and legitimizing this coup when she uses terms like the interim leadership, implying that in any way the cabal of bandits and thugs and fucking marauders who have taken control of Bolivia are in any way a legitimate form of government, interim or otherwise, is nonsense. They are violent thugs with guns who forced out the political opposition under false pretenses with violence. None of them were elected to the positions that they were in. And the Constitution of Bolivia gives them absolutely no authority to do any of the shit that they're doing. So if you want to talk about the future of Bolivia and you want to put in your 2 cents, how about we first start with the fucking right-wing lunatic Christian fundamentalist military junta that is just taking over control of Bolivia. You all need to step down because what the fuck you're doing is illegal. How about we start there and then we talk about interim leaderships and holding free and fair elections as soon as possible. But that wasn't bad enough. Elizabeth Warren couldn't leave it there. She was asked by one of her biggest defenders, Ryan Grimm. And personally, I like some of the work that Ryan Grimm does, but when it comes to Elizabeth Warren, let's just say he fits into TYT very well with his coverage of Elizabeth Warren. But he asked her about Bolivia in a quick interview that he did, and her answer was shit.
That spirit of kind of international solidarity, I want to ask you about Bolivia and the fight going on down there. The interim government has recently said that armed forces who shoot and kill protesters will have immunity during the protests. Do you believe that when the military pressured Evo Morales out of power that was a coup? And what is the U.S. role right now going forward?
Boy, it sure looks like that. You know, whenever the military intervenes in a civilian transfer of power, that's not good, and it is dangerous for democracy. I'm hopeful, based on the very latest developments, that maybe the parties are going to negotiate and get a real election in that country. We need to see the democratic process restored, and we need to see a leader in charge who's democratically elected, not put there by someone else.
And the last one, yeah. The OAS, which is largely funded by the U.S., is blamed by a lot of the Morales supporters for triggering the coup. Do you believe that the OAS is an impartial actor, or do you think that they're kind of operating on behalf of some of the more powerful forces there?
The OAS is the one that comes in to certify elections, and it's reasonable that people would depend on the OAS to be an independent body. Even so, that does not justify military intervention. When the military are pushing for change in government, that's not how we promote democratic forces.
So she's asked, do you think the military forcing Morales out was a coup? Elizabeth Warren, in her typical Lori Lee fashion, can never just answer a question, even if it is a yes or no question. And I know sometimes questions require nuance and detail and a well thought out explanation. Not this. Like I've gone over and over and at this point. What happened was just a coup. Period. Full stop. There's no debating. The military forced Morales out under threat of violence. That is a coup. Full stop. So when Elizabeth Warren is just dancing around it, that tells me she knows that it was a coup, but she doesn't want to say it because she doesn't want to upset the media. She doesn't want to upset the national security apparatus, but she knows that she can't just flat out say, no, I don't think it's a coup, because she's going to catch shit over that. So this is just Elizabeth Warren being calculating as usual. it's especially gross on this issue because we're talking about the U.S. yet again funding and supporting and propping up, providing logistical support and political cover to violent, right-wing, Christian fundamentalist, fascist leaderships in governments who, as soon as they assume power, begin to massacre protesters and dissidents. We're watching that happen again, and Elizabeth Warren still can't just be straight up about it. As usual, pussyfooting around it and trying to play both sides of the fence. She's trying to appease the neoliberal, neocon Washington establishment, foreign policy establishment, but she's also not trying to piss off the progressive left even more than she already has. But Ryan asked another question on the coup in Bolivia, and this answer might be worse than the last. I'll let you decide. Ryan Grimm explains to her how the OAS was a catalyst for this fucking coup. And when asked if it's independent, Elizabeth Warren, like I just said, she's trying to appease the establishment even though she knows that answer is bullshit. I guess I can see how some people could interpret this as Elizabeth Warren being ignorant about the OAS. But if you go back and just watch the response again, and I've watched it a couple times now, it looks like she's doing what she does when she's trying to calculate, when she's giving a lawyerly answer, when she's trying to bend the truth as much as it will bend without breaking it. She's trying to push the bullshit as far as it could go without telling an outright lie. That's what she looked like she was doing there. She says, when asked if the OAS is independent, again, this is a fairly simple question and a yes or no question. You could start with a yes or no and explain however much you want to explain it. But she doesn't do that. Instead, she goes into this weird thing where she starts explaining the OAS, what it's supposed to do. Like, she's reading, okay, the OAS is the organization that comes in and is supposed to certify elections in Latin America and yada yada. She's basically reading their overview, what it says on paper about the OAS, ignoring the context about the situation and about what we know what the OAS does, the Organization of American States, and how they undermine Latin American governments by casting doubt over what seemed to be legitimate elections. And Ryan Grimm just explained to you how that was a catalyst in Bolivia. Knowing all that context, she still can't just flat out just say, you know what? It doesn't seem like the OAS is acting independently. It does seem like they have political motivations. And you know, when you explain it like that, and when you also explain how they get their funding from the U.S. State Department, yeah, I think it's hard for anyone to say they're independent. That's what it looks like she wants to say. She looks like she knows that's the right answer, but she doesn't want to buck the establishment. She says it's reasonable for people to depend on the OAS to be an independent organization. It's reasonable for people to depend. Like, come on. That's not how regular people talk. That is, you know what the truth is, and like I said, you're trying to bend it as much as you can without breaking it and just telling a flat out lie. So instead of saying, yes, it's independent, I understand that why people will depend on the OAS to be independent. Come on, this is... Look, man, I said what I had to say about this. Her answer on Bolivia is terrible. She is apparently not in opposition of this violent right-wing coup, military coup to take over the government. She won't even call it a coup. But either way, what's clear is she's, from here on out, she's going to pretend like this is legitimate leadership in Bolivia by calling them the interim leadership instead of what they are, terrorists and thugs who took over the country by force. Now, Tulsi Gabbard, she put out a tweet about this over the weekend. She was one of the latest, or one of the last candidates to talk about it, and she did get shit over it. I mean, it's understandable because you are the anti-regime change candidate, and it appears we do have a case of the U.S. facilitating regime change yet again in a Latin American country to steal natural resources or for other geopolitical reasons. And you're silent about it for 2 weeks. Like, I get the criticism where people are coming from, but now that she put out her statement on it, her statement's good. She is clear. She's not mincing words. It's a coup. And she also puts in a line about how the U.S. and other countries shouldn't be interfering in the governance of Bolivia. So I guess that's her hinting at the fact that there is U.S. involvement in this coup. I mean, Bernie Sanders to this point hasn't really said anything about U.S. involvement, or at least I haven't heard him say anything about U.S. involvement, so I guess I could give Tulsi Gabbard credit there. But I don't know why she just won't go all the way. I don't know why, I don't know why they won't just go all the way and say, yeah, the CIA and the State Department appear to have toppled a democratically elected president in a Latin American country for the umpteenth time. I don't know how many dozens times they've done it already, but it seems like they've done it again. And this is a problem, and we need to stop it. I don't know why they won't just come out and say it, because the more information that comes out, it's not leaning in any other direction than that. More information comes out is just confirming and verifying that, oh yeah, this is definitely a U.S.-backed coup. So I don't know why they don't just come out and say it and just full-on blast the neocon national security apparatus for supporting violent, murdering death squads yet again in Latin America. I don't know why they won't just do it. But I have a lot to say about this situation in Bolivia. There are going to be a couple more videos that come out this week, hopefully, about it. But yeah, let me know what you guys think.